this way with the power of God's word. 700 years before Jesus was even born, the prophet Isaiah spoke to a people that were in terrible darkness, generations and generations and generations of darkness, terrible oppression they lived under. And the prophet Isaiah spoke words of hope, of an arriving king, a coming savior, the advent of the hope of the world. Some of his words were these: the people who walk in darkness will see, say it with me, a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, say this with me, a light will shine. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called, say this with me, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. When I was growing up, I loved Christmas, don't we all? You know, I loved all the special worship services that would take place in my home church, all the parties and the festivities that led up to the birth of Jesus, the birthday of Jesus. How many of you grew up doing birthday parties for Jesus? That was so fun. But you know, the older I got, strangely perhaps, one of my favorite worship services of the entire year didn't take place during the Christmas season, but instead during the week of Easter. In fact, on Good Friday, the day when we commemorate and remember actually not the arrival and the birth of Jesus, but the death of Jesus. It was called a Tenebrae service. I don't know if any of you have ever attended a Tenebrae service before, but in Latin, that's a Latin term meaning shadows or darkness. And the service goes like this. You come into a semi-dark sanctuary already, and a series of scripture passages are read that have all to do with that very last week of Jesus' life. And there are a bank of candles as these scripture passages are being read describing that last week of Jesus' life. There'll be moments of silence and a candle will be extinguished. And so as the service goes on, as we approach the death of Christ, the sanctuary, the room grows darker and darker and darker. And it's a way of helping worshipers kind of experience and feel what it might be like to lose the light of the world, to experience that just a little bit, helping us feel the absence of Christ. And that then can prepare us, or prepared us then, and still does for me now, for resurrection, for new life, rebirth, the joy of Easter morning. But Friday was different. You know, Easter morning was all about the joy. Friday was all about the darkness, about the pain, about the suffering. Now, before you would go into the Tenebrae service, we would be reminded that the service would end in total darkness, and I do mean total darkness. And so we were encouraged just to sit in that place for a while, just to sit in that darkness, to give our eyes time to adjust, and indeed they would, which that's a whole sermon in and of itself. Your eyes would eventually adjust to the darkness, and in time then you could move about in it. So the symbolism was very powerful. And though we wouldn't be told necessarily to leave in silence, everyone did, because the darkness was so heavy. You could feel it in your soul and even coming from your soul. And we were told to leave, very carefully, because guess what? In the dark, dangerous things can happen. We have to be really careful moving there, because you can get hurt. Each year, I know it sounds strange, but I would look forward to that service, especially as a teenager. You can grasp this, right? Because as a teenager, we all start getting a little maudlin. So I started to look forward to that service where I could sit and let all my real feelings come to the surface. A place where I felt safe in the darkness and no one could see if I was sad, or if I needed to cry, or just lay my head down and weep. It was a place where I could think about the hard parts of the Jesus story, the torturous parts, the wounded and the bleeding parts, and to acknowledge within this safe Christian setting what was hard and torturous and wounded in my own life. It was a place where those real feelings were not just accepted, but they were welcomed in the framework of faith. And even though that service took place in Lent, I'll just tell you, I've been thinking about it a good bit lately. Because our family has been going through a bit of a difficult time. And I know some of you may be going through some difficult things in your life as well. I love the theologian, Father Richard Rohr. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he's very well known in sort of the contemplative Christian movement. And Rohr says this. He says that Advent is a time to let darkness do its work in us. And I love that because we tend to think of Christmas as all light and all sparkle and shine. And no doubt, we all love that part of, I love that part of Christmas. We put our Christmas tree up last night. I know you cannot believe, just 2 weeks before Christmas, we put our Christmas tree up. It's still not decorated, but it has lights on it. Blasphemy, our pastor says. I love that shiny part of Christmas. You know, all the Christmas songs this time of year are talking about it. What's the old one that says, even the street lights blink a bright red and green? But Advent, the Advent experience from the very beginning was actually filled with darkness and uncertainty and even fear. What do you have on the back of your shirt today, Pastor? Fear is a liar. It is no coincidence, friends, that Advent occurs in the darkest part of winter. The longest day is December 21. It's coming up. The word Advent comes from the Latin adventus, meaning coming or arrival. And in this case, it's referring to the arrival of Jesus, the coming of the light of the world, as our mission statement says, to shine the light of Jesus into a dark and hurting world, right? Does anybody still practice, it's kind of an old-timey Christmas thing, but our family still does it, an Advent wreath at home? Maybe do you have an Advent wreath, a little evergreen wreath with the 4 candles on it? They might be purple with 1 pink one, or they could be blue. Probably we're the only ones that are old enough to still do that. But anyway, that practice dates all the way back. I've always found this interesting to pre-Christian Europe, where people had a big evergreen wreath and they would have all these candles on it. And beginning in the very dark part of the winter, they would begin weekly lighting a candle and then another one and then another one as a way of marking time towards spring, because it had gotten so dark and so cold. That would help them sort of anticipate and get excited and remember that though it was dark now and cold now, there was a coming time that it was going to warm back up. And so that was actually adopted by Christians in the 1500s as a way of marking the 4 weeks of Advent, anticipating the arrival of Jesus, anticipating his first birth and celebrating that. But also, Advent for us should be a time when we're also anticipating the second coming of Christ, when he returns to once again bring light. Well, this will last forever because he will banish all the darkness forevermore. That's good news. But for now, of course, we live in a dark time. For now, we live in that in-between time, the 2 times between the Advents, that first Advent of coming of Jesus and the second. And so Advent for us actually becomes a time for us to think about this relationship between darkness and light. You know, we actually think of light as good, don't we? And darkness as bad. But what about those in-between times? Dawn or dusk? In fact, the word twilight is an Old English word. Twi meant two lights, two lights. It was a time of day that held both in equal tension, not one or the other, but a transition time between light and darkness and light. And certain experiences, friends, and we all know this, fall also in between. They're not strictly light, they're not strictly dark. We may call these experiences, these times, liminal space. I don't know if you're familiar with that term at all, but liminal is, again, a Latin term meaning threshold. Threshold. It's like standing in a doorway that leads from this into that. Celtic spirituality terms this same idea a thin place, where the veil between heaven and earth, between the spirit world and the tangible world, becomes suddenly and unexplainably incredibly thin. And everything takes on a different nuance. Time takes on a different feeling. Meanings to things take on a different nuance. Liminal space can and often does disorient us. It's holy ground, absolutely, no doubt. But just like Moses, who stood on holy ground, he was standing before a burning bush with a voice speaking out of it. That is nuts. There's nothing comfortable about that. So while it might be holy, it is not comfortable. But it is a place of eventual transformation. But first, it is a place of terrible disequilibration. It is a place of not knowing. Very similar to the place that Mary found herself in when she is sound asleep in her bed at night, minding her own business, and an angel burst into her room and wakes her up out of a deep sleep with an outrageous and an impossible pronouncement that brought her anything but comfort. Liminal space is that experience betwixt and between the familiar and the completely unknown. And listen, I know that some of us are finding ourselves in just that kind of place right now. Perhaps it's a recent diagnosis of some kind. Or maybe it's a child about to leave home and, all that entails. It could be a job loss or a relationship that is unraveling. Or maybe a real change in season of life that kind of shifts everything. The world as we know it is suddenly thrown off its axis. It's tilted and we're disoriented, completely unsure of what's next. Father Richard Rohr says that we can think of this liminal space. I love this. This is a quote. Wow. Open up the heavens, right? We just asked for it, didn't we? It's a beautiful, beautiful analogy here. God's opening up the heavens for us this morning. He has a word for each of us this morning. I'll let it kind of subside just a little bit because I'm not sure you can hear. Father Richard Rohr says that we can think of this liminal space, and this is a quote, as God's waiting room where we await an appointment with the divine doctor. I don't want you to miss that, right? I'll say it again. The devil doesn't want me to say it, maybe. I don't know. Rohr says that we can think of liminal space as God's waiting room where we await an appointment with the divine doctor. I wish I could take credit for that. That was Rohr. Listen, the entire Advent experience, way back from the very beginning, was liminal space. Again, remember how I started our message this morning? 700 years before Jesus was born, Isaiah foretold it, coming of a time when darkness and light would meet in an epic divine encounter that would forevermore change everything about the world that had ever been. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Read this whole thing with me. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. For to us a child is born, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Do you believe it? Have you experienced it? Friends, this is the ultimate liminal space. This between darkness and light, between known and unknown, where all the Christmas characters and us all eventually find ourselves. Think about it. Mary and Joseph, what was that like for them? What about Zachariah and Elizabeth? What about those poor shepherds just minding their sheep on a hillside one night? They're about to have the shock of their lives when angels appear. Think about that. We get so used to this story that we don't grasp how freaky it was. These are spiritual, celestial beings from another plane of existence that appear with an unbelievable, unimaginable message. And here's how all these messages begin. I want you to hear this. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Why do these angels always say this? Are you friggin' kidding me? We only say don't be afraid to people when there's every reason to be afraid. Mary, Joseph, Zachariah, the shepherds, they're all just going about their business when suddenly their worlds are totally turned upside down, and there is indeed very much to be terrified of. Their whole worlds, as they know it, are being threatened. And so when we hear this message, do not be afraid, we know we should very much be afraid. Be afraid, be very afraid. Everything is about to change. But listen, it happened then and it happens now. I want you to hear this. God's interruptions are also God's invitations. God's interruptions are also God's invitation. God is up to something. And this thin space, this liminal space, is God's waiting room. The divine doctor is up to something, and it involves us. And according to the Advent story, it's going to be scary. It is going to be. Not it might be. It could be. It's going to be. It's going to be scary because following God is just not easy. Our lives become His, and they are going to be disruptive. And you know what? We don't like to be inconvenienced, even if it's by God. And besides, and this is a big one, God's purposes are very often quite different from our plans. His purposes are different from our plans. Like when this sweet, unwed teenager is told that she's pregnant with a son of God, no less. That was inconvenient. I mean, she was planning a wedding to a human. And God interrupts her life with this sacred invitation that disturbs all her plans forever. But it also reveals God's eternal plans and purposes. And I do not know how this divine drama plays out in your life. But when God interrupts you, you can be guaranteed it is an invitation to something else. And you're going to discover that His purposes are indeed different than your plans. It happens to all of us all over and over and over again. Maybe for you, it looks like this. You've always dreamt of having this perfect little family from the time you were a child. You had it in your mind, your spouse, what your kids were going to be like. And then all of a sudden you find out you're going to have a child with special needs. Real big special needs. And you wonder, God, I didn't have this planned. Why? Lord, why us and why him? Now life is never going to be the same. And you have no idea how very right you are or how very unique, what a unique blessing this child will be. He will bring you closer to God than you've ever been. He will keep you on your knees till they are calloused, and he will stretch your heart more than you ever dreamt possible, because God's purposes are bigger and better than your plans. Maybe it's the loss of a job. You lose your job and you're like, oh my gosh, I've got kids to feed. I've got bills to pay. What am I going to do now? And you start searching for jobs, but all the job leads just seem to be drying up. And so you know what? You finally just start that business. It's always been just this niggling thing in the back of your mind, or you start and plant a church. That actually happened to us one time, many years ago. And then if you're like us years later, you get to look back and think, oh my goodness, God's purpose was bigger than my plan. What we thought at the time was a curse was actually a blessing. It's so scary at the time, though. Being involved in God's divine drama is not, my friends, about living a life of comfort. That is a lie we buy into. It is not about living a life of smooth sailing where we get to put Jesus in our back pocket like a rabbit's foot. It's not like that. And Advent shows us that. Advent shows us the alternative reality, the real reality, where God's love shows up when and how and where we least expect it and sometimes don't want it. Advent is our liminal space, straddling darkness and light, where it is normal to feel disoriented, so that we can open ourselves up and make room for Jesus to be born, for something new, for something holy to move in. God enters our lives, the darkness, the confusion, the mess, with his own plans, his own purposes, often impossible to welcome or understand in the moment. A previous church I pastored would put on a live nativity every year. Have you ever been to one of those? They're really cool. I know several of them around town if you're interested. Over time, this live nativity at this church became this entire community-wide event, and thousands of people literally would attend every year. We worked on it really hard all throughout the year, and our costumes were all, Joe was a part of that church. Our costumes were all, the other Joe, costumes were all really realistic, and we built sets that really did look like a biblical village and all this kind of stuff, and it was all very authentic. We even had this really beautiful Moravian star that was suspended in the sky that would light up at just the right time, magically, and it would illumine the way for the visitors through the darkness to a stable where they would discover the Holy Family, complete every year with a real live newborn baby. As a matter of fact, some of our grandchildren were the baby Jesus. Joe, were your kids either the baby Jesus? Well, this particular year, as I was walking through, taking some guests, we would have guides that would take them through the process, and I was guiding some guests through. We had come, we weren't yet over to the stable or anything. We were walking through the village, and then we'd gone out into the Galilean hills, and we were standing at the sheep pen where there were shepherds tending their flock, when on cue, the heavenly host appeared in the night sky. Now, really, it was just some of the church ladies dressed in white gossamer gowns with an eerie blue light behind them. They had these giant feathered wings we had created, and a smoke machine was blowing smoke, but it really looked amazing. And this appears, and this little girl is standing beside me at the sheep pen. She's about 4 years old. And when that light illumined those church ladies, those angels on the roof, she gasped, "Oh, it's my first real live angels." It was precious. And then right on time, that Moravian star began to light and glow in the night sky, and several of the shepherds invited us to follow that star. We made our way over to the rough-hewn stable, and when we got there, the shepherds, as they had been instructed to do, knelt, and you could just see some of the people begin to kneel too. We all felt like kneeling. It was freezing cold that night, but somehow we all felt strangely warmed, seeing that young teenage Mary hovering over the manger, proud Joseph protectively by her side. Both of them, all of us gazing in wonder at the real live newborn baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying peacefully on that bed of hay. It was surreal. It was thin, liminal space. And seemingly out of thin air, you had to strain at first to hear, came the soft strains of music. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Only I can tell you something. Bessie the donkey, she wasn't really feeling it. She wasn't feeling so calm and bright in that moment. As a matter of fact, very contrary to her very placid nature, Bessie began kind of stomping her feet and snorting a little bit, feeling maybe a little bit anxious, and then backing up and lifting her tail right next to the baby Jesus, she deposited a hot, steaming pile of manure. Joseph looked embarrassed, and Mary took her shawl and covered her nose, and the youngest shepherds began to snicker. But I thought to myself, well, welcome to the world, baby Jesus. This is it. This is real life. A freezing cold night in a dark, dirty stable with a hot pile of manure. This is what you came to. This is what you came for. Real life, messy, like mine and like yours. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called, say it with me, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Friends, this year, in the midst of our darkness, may we once again welcome his light. In our overcrowded lives, our steaming, hot, messy lives, may we welcome him. May we be willing to be inconvenienced by God's interruptions, because I can promise you that his purposes are bigger and better than our plans. May we be willing to sit in that uncomfortable liminal space of God's waiting room, knowing that the divine doctor is up to something holy and something bigger than we are. Would you pray with me?